Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Today we're talking about F1 the movie, which is winding down its theatrical run but should be streaming on Apple TV Plus soon. My guest making his Below the Line debut is first assistant director Toby Hefferman, who is also credited as an executive producer on the film. Toby, welcome to Below the Line.
Thank you very much, Skid. Very pleased to be here. Honored to be here.
Glad to have you here as well, Toby. A warning for listeners, today's conversation will contain spoilers. Toby, let's get right into it. How did you get involved with this project?
Well, it started way back in just before Christmas 22. Daniel Lupi, who's the exec producer, line producer on the movie, he'd contacted me in previous times about projects. They never kind of lined up. And he called me. This job was happening. It was just before Christmas. And he said, hey, are you free? And I just come off June Part 2. And I said to him, what's the project about? He said, it's F1. And I was like, I'd never seen an F1 race. I wasn't interested in F1. I actually don't like cars at all. And the first thing I said to him was, Daniel, I don't want to talk myself out of a job, but you should get the guy that did Rush or Fast and Furious. He said, look, watch Drive to Survive over Christmas. Joe Kosinski, Jerry Bruckheimer, they're coming over in the new year, and have a meet, see how you feel. So over Christmas, I watched Drive to Survive. Credit to those guys. They've put together a brilliant show. And it kind of had me hooked. It was 5 seasons. And I got through all of them over the period and met with Joe and Jerry at the beginning of January, and the meeting went well, and suddenly I was on the job. And I said to Daniel, I can't start until April. I've just finished a job. I'm beaten up. I want to give you my best. And he said, all good, all good. Start in April. And suddenly it was the end of January and I was in Daytona. So, and I was like, hold on, what just happened? And I was sort of on the job. But that's how it kind of kicked off.
Now, you mentioned Dune 2. You have credits on a lot of large, massive films. But talk to me about how F1 ranked up to that and what the challenge was going to be with this film particularly.
Once I'd sort of looked into Drive to Survive, it really gives you an insight to not just guys in cars driving at 200 miles an hour around tracks. It's the backstory. It's the politics of the sport. It's the pit crews, the teams around them. It's an incredible sport, and it's very, very similar to the film industry in a way. You can compare them with the drivers being the actors, for instance, the team principals being the producers, and you've got the crew, which are the crew, and it's got these sort of big similarities. And so when I sort of looked into how dense the sport was, I realized how attractive it was going to be and how challenging it was going to be. And it wasn't going to be straightforward. And Joe Kosinski's vision, which he stood by to his credit, was this is Top Gun on wheels. We did it on Top Gun. We achieved it. I've set a benchmark for myself, and I don't want to go under that bar. I need to up that bar. And I was like, you know what? We're very lucky in what we do, and we never do the same thing twice. And the more experience you get, the more challenging you want the jobs to be. And it's like Joe, he set this bar and you set a bar for yourself. And I was like, you know what? This seems like a challenge. I'm not sure if it's going to come off, but hey, I'm game. And that was just attractive in itself.
I know you guys faced some challenges, and we're going to talk about them down the line as far as execution on the production. But out the gate, how much prep time did you have, and what was the planned shooting schedule?
Well, we were led by the Formula One calendar, because obviously, for those that have seen it, we were filming in the live events, and Silverstone 24 was where we kicked off, and that's the beginning of July. So that was the anchor point in the schedule. We had to start shooting then because that was the first major race and we couldn't miss it. So the project had been in development prior. Joe and Claudia had been working on the kind of camera technology or furthering it from what they developed on Top Gun Maverick. And as I said, I sort of came on, I met in January, I did a little scout to Daytona, I took February off, and I started properly in earnest in March, which is when we had a script and when storyboards started to roll out. So sort of from March through the end of June, that was the prep period. And given the technology and the amount of testing and training that was necessary, it was just the right amount of prep.
And what kind of AD team did you have backing you up on this project?
Well, I had a great team. I mean, the team I had on June 2, a lot of them were local hires, and a lot of people from that had all decided to move up and everything else. So I teamed back up with my key second AD, David Keedle. I also brought on a guy called Donald Bentley, and Donald Bentley worked with me since Rogue One, Star Wars Rogue One, and he's sort of grown through the ranks. He's always been on the floor with me, and he's a first AD in his own right now. So I brought him on as our sort of first AD. We projected there was going to be some second unit or splinter work with all the driving stuff in the original schedule. And not only that, but the complexity, the safety element of the cars and where the cars were launched from. They were launched a lot of the time remotely. They weren't exactly on site where I was. So I needed somebody of that sort of level of responsibility who understood the safety, who could look after those things for me. So there was David Keedle, key second. There was Donald Bentley, who was an additional first for the sort of picture cars. And then we had a really tight team. I had two people on the floor with me, two seconds on the floor, Jack McCabe and Georgia Lewis. Jack McCabe I'd worked with before, Georgia I hadn't. And they were my kind of, they were my armor on the set. They were directly with me on the floor. And then we had four PAs, and then we supplemented with additional people as we needed it. But it had to be tight because when you are shooting at a Grand Prix, there's a very, very small amount of people that are allowed to be accredited to be within the group. So it had to be small. It was small and tight, and everyone did a phenomenal job.
Now, the idea, Toby, of filming the movie during live events and sort of following the races as they're actually done, it blows my mind a little bit. Talk to me more about the relationship with F1 and how this came about, and then how you integrated with, again, they're having races where there are stakes, like they're actually racing, and it's not like you can have them go again. I just talk to me more about how this collaboration came together with F1.
Yeah, F1 had kind of partnered with Joe and Jerry. It was a long-standing relationship, and F1 saw obviously the movie as a great way of promoting the sport globally and extending it, to those people that weren't necessarily fans. So they were always incredibly supportive. But, when push came to shove and we were actually having to then put ourselves out there in a live event, that's where it's like, well, none of that was really discussed. In principle, it was, but it was like, okay, let's get down to the nuts and bolts. So I remember vividly, Tim Bampton was our F1 liaison. He was put in charge of our production. And I remember we had our storyboards for Silverstone, and I sat with him and our production designer, Mark Tilsley, in Mark's office, and we were going through the storyboards. It was a small group, and we had to say to him, okay, so this is what we want to pull off. And we didn't know what his reaction was going to be. And, the spoiler alert coming, we have these two cars. What we said was like, look, so basically, Tim, it's the beginning of a formation lap. There's the legacy, the real 20 cars on the grid. And we want to put two of our cars on the back of the grid on the formation lap, where prior to that, drivers being prepared, they're getting in the cars pull away for the formation lap, and then we want our cars to pull away as well. And I looked at him and I was like, this is going to be sort of make or break time. And what's this guy going to be about? And is he going to be supportive, or is he just going to give us a straight no? And I looked at him and he smiled at me. And I thought, this man's for us. He's got that sort of giddy enthusiasm where it's like, well, this sounds completely nuts. This is unprecedented, but hey, we're going to have to prove ourselves. We're going to have to meet with the FIA. We're going to have to meet with a lot of people to get this through. But yeah. And I said, look, Tim, just so you know, this is one example of many things we want to do. And he said, look, Silverstone's the first race. You want to do this. If you play your cards right, the doors will open. If you play your cards right to what you want to do in Hungary and what we eventually wanted to do and achieved in Abu Dhabi. So I was like, okay, all in, let's do it. And then I was like, oh, and by the way, there's a national anthem and we want the drivers to be next to the driver. He laughed and I was like, oh no, 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 I'm serious. We want to do that too. And he was like, oh no, come on, you're taking the biscuit. I was like, well, one step at a time. And again, this was Joe's vision. And Joe, is extraordinary in his bullishness and stubbornness in the most positive way, where, a lot of us would be like, well, we can do it in VisFX. We could do it against a blue screen. We could have Brad and Damson driving in a volume in a lighting environment. And he was like, no, no, we're doing this for real. It's going to be safe and it's going to be done for real. And yeah, everyone was on board. So that was the kind of first dealings with F1.
Toby, you talked about doing it for real. Let's go deeper into the actual challenges of capturing this footage, what the risks were, what you had to do to just, again, to document the races the way that you did.
The process, for instance, for Silverstone, again, being our first race and us really being incredibly disciplined and for every race we had to do this, the same kind of way. But while we were shooting, we didn't have the luxury of the prep time we had for Silverstone. But for instance, the procedure for the beginning of the Silverstone race, from the national anthem to Brad and Damson walking through the grid, where the grid walk was going on and being sort of ushered out, to Brad getting in the car, to us doing a driver's switch, and for the cars to be pulling away. We had to set that whole thing up at Silverstone, which we bought out an amount of days for rehearsals. And we rehearsed it ourselves. We parked 20 of the crew cars in the places where the F1 cars go, and we had our cars at the back, and we timed it out because everything had to be timed to the second. And we ran it with ourselves. We ran it with stand-ins. Then we incorporated the actors. And then we did everything to the race starts. And then when we felt comfortable, we brought the F1 team in and the FIA, who ultimately who are the governing body, who tell us whether or not we're going to be able to do it or not. We did a full show and tell at Silverstone, and they all conferred and they agreed we could do it as long as we had a plan. If one of the cars didn't start, we could push it through a crash gate and not affect the race, because, the stakes are so high. We can't stop F1. And we also need to be under the cloak where we're not in the international feed, because people aren't interested in necessarily movie making. They're there to watch the F1 race. They're not interested in Apex. So we had to be very cute about also sort of being under the cloak and being hidden from the international feed and working our way sort of out of those broadcast cameras. So that was another kind of thing that we had to sort of, work around. But, everything we did had massive risk. And there were certain contingency plans where there wasn't a contingency plan. And we had to go on faith, in good faith, knowing that everyone was totally professional and we did it in a very disciplined way. But for the movie, it's one thing for F1, but it's also for the movie, because we weren't going to get a second go at what we did at some of these races, because there was no second take. So everyone had to be so buttoned up. Again, it's a shout out to our crew and our cast for, their longevity at this incredibly sort of disciplined way of working.
You've described how your shooting schedule was aligned with the actual F1 races. But in July 2023, SAG-AFTRA goes on strike. How did that affect your plans?
Well, it was one of those things. The looming of the SAG strike, everyone was an expert. Everyone was like, well, it's not going to happen. They're going to settle before. So Silverstone was the beginning of July. We did it as a pre-shoot. It was my 50th birthday on qualifying, and it was like, the least like birthday I've ever had in my life. So we got through the Grand Prix, and then we had 2 days off. We had the Monday and Tuesday off after the Grand Prix, which is on a Sunday. And then we were shooting in a pub. It was the pub scene between Brad and Kerry Condon. And we were shooting that on the Wednesday. And Wednesday, the 12th of July, is when the SAG strike was happening. And the strike happened. We shot that day, and then we had to shut down. So it became a reality. And we were like, so how long is the SAG strike going to be? We'd bought out a lot of days at Silverstone that were very expensive. We were due to go to Budapest for the Grand Prix the week after, followed by Monza. And obviously the movie was meant to come out the following year. So we were like, well, what's going to happen? And we were all hoping that the SAG strike was going to be resolved. So what we did is we shot, and this worked out really well for Joe and Claudio. because they weren't used to having a second unit. They didn't really have a second unit on Top Gun Maverick. Like most directors, they want to shoot every frame of the movie. Because the amount of driving, we had scheduled a second unit to cover a lot of that stuff. So the fortuitous thing that happened out of the SAG strike was we had all these days at Silverstone. We had all these other Grand Prix we were going to. Obviously, you can only plan with what you know, and no one knew when the SAG strike was going to come to an end. But we kept shooting. We minimized our crew as best we could. Everyone was very fair because obviously the crew were expecting to be on this job, and the production team were very, very good in as far as the welfare of the crew. And so we just started shooting the action sequences because we're at Silverstone. It's like, well, let's just keep shooting because the other drivers who doubled for the actors, they weren't, SAG, they were equity. So we could keep shooting with them. So there was a lot we could keep doing. And because we just started, there was a huge amount. So we just kept on going. And we shot through the days at Silverstone. We ended up going to the Grand Prix in Budapest. There was a lot of work we could do on the pit wall. There was a lot of driving stuff because at a Grand Prix, F1 gave us what we called hot laps, which were throughout the weekend, 10-minute windows, 20-minute windows, where we could put our cars out on the track between Porsche Super Cup, F2, F3. We had these small windows where we had crowds in the stands. We had sports signage. We had all the production value. We couldn't waste that. So we'd send the doubles out, getting some, car to car work. And then there was the big sort of Parc Fermé scene at Hungary. So we shot that, like wide shots of all that business, and we put our cars in. So we really made it sort of efficient in the time that we didn't have the actors. And we kept on going. We kept on going up until Monza. And then at the end of Monza, which was the sort of beginning of September, really, we kind of run out of track to put in front of us. So we had to hiatus. But we then had additional Grand Prix coming up. So we had Japan. So we sent a splinter unit out to Japan to get some B-roll stuff for the montage. So that kind of worked. But then we had Vegas coming up. And Vegas was coming up at the sort of mid-November to Abu Dhabi. And Vegas was big. And Abu Dhabi was big. But unfortunately, the strike, didn't come to an end in time. So we went out to Vegas. And what we realized was, there's some vis effects in this movie, not as much as you'd think, but there's still stuff that needs to be turned over. And it was really, really important to Joe and Jerry that we met the release date, which was the summer this year. So what we realized was through all the second unit work, which we shot as a main unit, Vegas was an example where there was another spoiler alert, a crash where one of the cars has a crash against a fence, and we couldn't do that in a live event. So we did it as a plate, and VisFX were always gonna generate that crash, and that was a big one. That was going to take some time. So we went out to Vegas as a splinter crew, and we shot the crash, and VisFX could turn that over. And also what Joe could do is Joe could start editing as well. He could start putting some stuff together and getting a feel for this and really cherry picking what he needed as well for when we came back. So the same thing with Abu Dhabi. We went out to Abu Dhabi, we shot some hot laps, we shot some wides, we got as much as we could. And then the SAG strike resolved itself. And suddenly we're like, okay, we're in January, which is when we're meant to end, which is where we pretty much started. And, again, the whole schedule was based on the race calendars. And January was Daytona. January 2024 was Daytona in January. And that's the beginning of the movie. And that's where we started again, but properly, SAG strike resolved, and off we went.
Watching the movie, obviously, we jump from race to race very quickly. In real life, how far apart are they staged? Like, how often is there a F1 race?
Well, the calendar it's a sort of mixed bag. You can have triple headers where there's 3 races in consecutive weekends. August, there's their summer break, so they take a 4-week break. So that was the pressure at the end of our schedule, where when we finally went back in 2024 to Silverstone, we had a double header of Silverstone, Hungary, and Monza, and we had to go to them all. And also, we had 6 cars, and we had to ship them all with all the equipment and get the cars in at the right time because there's a curfew to get gear into the Grand Prix. So it wasn't like you could just air freight or drive it. You had to get it in. And this is where we had to become, and this is again where you take your hats off to the F1 teams. You watch them work. A Grand Prix starts, and you walk through the paddock, and they're already striking because they know they've got to get that stuff on the road and to the next Grand Prix. And we had to work in the same way. And honestly, it really tuned us up. I mean, we pride ourselves. I think every film crew are like, we are military precision. We
Indeed.
we don't waste a second of time. And you look at these guys, and you're like, oh shit, we got a lot to learn. It was very humbling. And it honestly, it fine-tuned us. It really did. It was very humbling.
Favorite locations? I mean, all this bouncing around. I can't imagine.
Oh
You've
man.
just wrapped a thing. You're shooting where you are now. You got to be thinking about the next place you're going. But which ones really stuck with you?
I mean, they every Grand Prix we went to, it seemed that every time there was a new benchmark that we hit, and each one they were so at the time they were like, so scary. You're like, are we going to get through this? Are we going to manage to get it done? And then the end of the day, the satisfaction is immense. I don't know. I kind of measure it in. We used to run the tracks, so a group of us used to run the tracks. So I kind of measure it a little bit by the aesthetic. I mean, Monza and Spa were like the prettiest. The most insane was Abu Dhabi in 24. That was the third act. That was the most insane. And I've got a huge, huge love for Mexico because we did some absolutely mental stuff there. And I've never ever been, I mean, Silverstone's close, but Mexico in the main sort of stadium area of the track, it's a coliseum and the crowd are so passionate. It's frightening, but incredibly inspiring at the same time. So Mexico, I mean, they've all got their sort of pros and cons. I mean, look, honestly, I'm privileged to have been part of any of them. There wasn't a bad one. Hopefully that rounds it up. They were all great in their own ways.
So, Toby, we talked about the SAG strike and how it actually extended some of your shoot, and you got to have a second visit to some of these races. But were there any races that you weren't going to get a second chance?
Well, yeah, the race we weren't going to get back to again because of the calendar was Abu Dhabi, and that was December 24. And the movie was coming out in June, so we had no choice. But the bigger thing was it was the third act, and there was a huge amount of footage that we needed to acquire for the movie. It was the answer to many questions within the movie that needed to be answered. And basically, it was sort of everything we'd done at every Grand Prix rolled into one. It was like the biggest risk, and it was the biggest challenge of for everybody because without this we didn't have a third act and we weren't going to shoot it against blue screen. And it started with Brad on the grid. We had Tobias Menzies in a Paddock Club. There was a moment between them. There was once that exchange had happened, Brad then had to turn. He had to do his sort of payoff to Cavendish the reporter as he walked down the grid to do the drivers parade, the national anthem, which again we shot live. And then we had to, as Brad was walking down the grid, I mean, I'll give you the sort of timeline of what we did, if that makes sense, so you can kind of work out what we had to shoot as we go. So as Brad and Damson were walking down for the national anthem, our cars had to get pulled off the grid because of the start of the race. We shot the national anthem, and we had four cameras on the grid. We had one that was in the Paddock Club with Tobias Menzies that had to stay there for the end. Everyone was cleared off. The race started. We continued to shoot because we had to get a load of coverage of Javier and Bernadette inside the garage as the race was going on. And the thing with Abu Dhabi, it starts at sunset. So you've got sunset into kind of blue hour into night. So it's not like, hey, this scene's day, this one's night, and you know what it's like with movie making, you have to stretch this thing. So, we had to get all this stuff at the right time of the day as well. So we got back to our garage, the race started, we were shooting, we had all the production value. And then 20 laps toward the end, we all had to get ready for the finale. So we had four cameras ready in the garage, our picture garage. We had basically our pit crew watching the race, waiting for it to end. We had a camera still in the Paddock Club, waiting for the fireworks to go off. And as the winning car went through the checkered flag, the fireworks start going off. We had the permission to then, for all of our drivers, run across to the pit wall where our cameras followed, where we shot everybody celebrating as if we'd won the race. Fireworks live. We had Stefano Domenicali, who was doing his cameo as Javier was walking down toward the podium. He did his thing. We managed to do that twice. And then we were basically 6 minutes behind everything that was going on. So we did our celebrations, but our cue 6 minutes after the car went through is we had to be on the grid because we had to bring our cars on as the winning cars were going off to Parc Fermé to be weighed, for then Brad and Damson to be getting, or Brad to be getting out the car with Damson walking up to him, them celebrating. While at this point, the drivers, the real F1 drivers, are going up to the podium. We then got moved off as they were walking onto the podium, and then we had to follow them up. So once the podium was finished, they came off the podium, and then we walked onto the podium. It was a kind of insane thing that we had to follow on, and everything had to work in clockwork. And we had to capture this footage. And the sort of mad story was we were heading up to the podium. We had to find George Russell because he wasn't on the podium and he had a disappointing race. So we're like, George, we need you because he was the winner of 23. We were shooting the 23 season, so we had to be accurate to that. So we got George, we pulled him up. Charles was on the podium already. So he was up in the cool down room, which is where we were standing by. And again, we couldn't interrupt the international feed. So we weren't allowed on the podium until their transmission had ceased. Tim Bampton, our F1 liaison, we'd set up a long line mic because we needed to keep all the punters in their seats. So as when we did our podium, that we were going to get that production value. And when a Grand Prix finishes, people want to leave. Do you know what I mean? So Tim said he was going to give me the signal when I could go grab the mic and run out there and say to everyone, hey, do you want to be in a Hollywood movie, and keep everyone in their seats? Tim had run into Zach Brown, who he used to work with, and Zach started talking to him, and I was waiting for the signal. And Tim looked round to me and gave me a kind of wink, and I thought, like, well, that's the signal. So I saw the mic on the ground. I opened the door. I got the mic. I ran out to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, yada, 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 complete spontaneity. Fortunately, there was, it was still 98% packed. I didn't realize Tim's wink was just a wink of affection. The F1 broadcast was still going on, and I was getting these text messages saying, hey, you're trampling all over the F1 broadcast. We can hear you on the live broadcast. I was like, oh my God. Anyway, kept everyone on. Finally got the kind of correct signal. And then we brought Brad, Javier, Charles Leclerc, George Russell out, and we did our podium celebrations. Everyone stayed below in the stands, and it was insane. And but without that footage, we didn't have what we needed in the third act. And it was an insane end to the production, and that's where we finished. And again, could we have recreated it against blue screen? Yeah, of course we could. But when you look at the final product, there's no recreating that in post, no matter how brilliant vis effects and AI are these days. So,
well, talk to me about the cast on this. How did they take to the challenges of filming under these conditions?
they were brilliant. It's very easy to say, oh, we couldn't have had anyone better collectively, but it's true. I mean, Brad, I'd worked with before on some productions, and he's an incredible driver anyway. But he also was very humbled by what the task was in front of him. He had to act and drive at excessive speeds, and very life-risking stuff. But again, incredibly professional. Same with Damson. Damson, lesser experienced, but so keen to get in those cars. The drivers that they drove with, Luciano Pachetta and Craig Dolby. It was a partnership between Luciano and Brad, and Damson and Craig. And And those guys just trained and trained and trained and trained and didn't stop. It wasn't like, oh, well, I need my 12-hour turnaround. It was like, when can we get back in the cars? I'm not ready. Silverstone's coming. I want to be good. They were so disciplined. Javier Bardem, incredible man. These guys like Javier, Kerry, they were put in a position where it wasn't like, hey, go back to your trailer. We're going to be 45 minutes. We'll give you a call. It's like, guys, you got to stay on site. They'd be helping move boxes around. Everyone just, again, it was a really great thing. All the armor was sort of stripped off everybody. Everyone had to become part of this apex team and everyone embraced it. And honestly, I think everyone got so much out of it because why would you want to sit in a trailer when you've got a Grand Prix going on? I mean, it's an incredible experience just to be there and take it all in. But yeah, they were amazing. Brad has the kind of nerves of steel, and I remember the Silverstone Grand Prix, the national anthem. We called the guys on 5 minutes before the drivers were called to the national anthem. And I remember him standing there, and it's the first time I think I've ever seen him look slightly concerned because, suddenly there's a realization that he's sort of got to be standing there next to Carlos Sainz and, doing a national anthem. And again, I think the realization had dawned on him, which was like, this is unprecedented. In all his years of acting and everything he'd done, he'd never done anything as batshit crazy as this. But they were great. They were great.
You talked about how the film crew could learn some from the race car crews. I'm also curious, though, how the actual F1 drivers and their personnel who show up on camera, how did they take to filming and what kind of challenges did that present for you?
I think they found us kind of quite interesting. I think that we were a little sort of, we're like aliens that have kind of landed on their planet a little bit. So to begin with, the first one, as I said, was Silverstone. We were sandwiched between Ferrari and Mercedes. And there was some kind of looks like, what are these guys up to? They liked our garage. It was, a decent garage and everything else, but they didn't quite believe that we were ever going to kind of, we were the real thing. And so they were very kind of curious. But I think we were a kind of welcome distraction as well. They come along garage and they'd act very cool. It was, a bit like Greece, and then eventually they'd sort of come in and they'd be like, oh, can we look around your garage? And they're like, absolute pleasure. Please, please, we're your guests. Come in. You can do whatever you like. So there was this curiosity. And then Joe wanted to feature as many drivers. I mean, he wanted every driver if he could, and as many team principals as we could, and as much involvement from the teams as we could. So throughout the job, we were trying to pepper in little cameos for them, and so we had to work with drivers sort of individually, and they were great. They were brilliant. Again, they're such busy people because they've got so many things to do. Plus, you've got to be very kind of mindful that they've got a race to win and you want to leave them in that kind of focus mindset. So, we get them for like a 10-minute window. For instance, there's a scene at the beginning of Silverstone where Sonny's sort of, holding the beginning of the race up a little bit, and you've got Lando looking in his rearview mirror and Charles Leclerc doing the same thing. So we'd be like, okay, guys, we need a 10-minute window to shoot this. And we'd have like the 3 cameras set up and they'd bring their cars in and we'd park our cars in. And it was, again, this kind of great military sort of setup where we'd park the cars behind, have a few background buzzing around just to give it that kind of feel. And the guys were great. I mean, they really were like, what are these guys doing? It made no sense to them. And then, the thing is, we were such guests in their world. We had to be really careful. And F1 kept on reminding us, it's like, don't be complacent. Don't wander around the paddocks. Don't try to get into a garage unless you've got permission. Don't run up to the drivers and try to get autographs. Be professional. And we had our own kind of kit as well. So we looked the part as the additional kind of team on the circuit. And also, we were worried. We never wanted to become a pain in the ass. We never wanted to ask too much, but we also needed to continually ask favors. So it was kind of making sure we were strategic about that, knowing that as the calendar ran sort of toward the end, we were going to ask for more and more and more and more. So we kind of try to keep ourselves to ourselves, but again, embrace them. and do everything we could to become the best dinner party guests who were going to be invited back.
Well, speaking of being invited back, F1 has done very well at the box office, so it should surprise no one that there's already talk of a sequel. Any of this discussed on set while you guys were filming?
Oh no, we didn't know if we were going to even finish the movie. No, I mean, honestly, it was such a race to the finish line. I mean, you think we finished December, this Abu Dhabi crescendo, and the movie was coming out in June, and Joe had a post. VisFX had to turn everything around, and music needed to be scored. There was so much to do. Of course, we all talked about wanting to do it again. And everyone joked the sequel should be called F2, which would be, less exciting and a little noisier. But no. It was let's get this one in the bag. Let's just get this one in the bag.
All right, well, we wait to hear more about the sequel to F1 that may or may not happen. What is next for you, Toby? Where next are we going to see your work?
I'm currently in deep prep with Sam Mendes on the Beatles movies, which again is a new challenge. The only cars in there probably don't go past 40 miles an hour if they even start. But it's a new challenge. It's an exciting challenge. Again, as I said earlier, we're very fortunate never to do the same thing twice. I'm a big fan of the Beatles, big fan of Sam Mendes, so I'm very excited for this new thing.
I'm excited for that project as well. For us, though, that's going to be a wrap on the episode and a wrap on season 24 of the podcast. Toby, really glad you could join me for this one. Thanks so much.
No, thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure.
Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. My email address is skid@belowtheline.biz. That's B-I-Z. Belowtheline.biz is also our website, where you'll now find 270 episodes. So if you're a new listener, check out the catalog. As I noted earlier, this is a wrap on season 24, but I've got some fun episodes lined up for season 25, so please subscribe if you haven't already. Closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and to all of our listeners, I appreciate you. A special shout out to listener Marcos Vieira, who wrote me and suggested an episode about F1, which is what prompted me to contact Toby. Marcos, thanks for reaching out. To all fans of Below the Line, I hope you'll consider a purchase. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. Other ways you can help. First, give us a positive rating wherever you get your podcast. Second, tell your friends about an episode you enjoyed, because that's how we gain new listeners. Whether directly via email or anywhere on social media, I really do appreciate your feedback. All of that aside, whatever your engagement, the fact that you're still listening means a lot to me, and I hope you'll stick with us for the new season. Thanks again from Below the Line.